How are you doing? I'm Tom, and today I'm at a little place that most of you have never heard of. It's called the Long Cane Indian Massacre Site, and I'm just outside of a little town that most of you have never heard of called Troy, South Carolina. And the reason I'm here is because this place answered a question for me that I'd had for years, and I think some of you might find this interesting and possibly useful. And the question's concerning the Trail of Tears. And for those of you that don't know what that was, you need to look it up. It was a really horrible time in American history where several Indian tribes were forced marched to Oklahoma. And the last relocation was of the Cherokee Nation. And they were forced marched from North Georgia, North Carolina to Oklahoma in the dead of winter. And it was horrible. Women and children, a lot died along the way. And again, it's a really horrible thing. Well, when I first heard about that, my question was, how could people of that period do something so cruel? Well, the answer to that, at least in part, is right here. In 1760, the settlers of this area heard that the Cherokee were on the warpath and sending raiding parties in and killing settlers, so they decided to leave. Well, on their way to a small fort just outside of Augusta, Georgia, they were overtaken by a group of Cherokee warriors. And it was a massacre. 23 were killed, 14 were taken captive, 9 children were scalped and left for dead and miraculously survived. This massacre would have had a huge influence on the people living in this area and how they felt about the Cherokee. Well, one of the families was the Jackson family. Andrew Jackson, who would later become president and the one who was responsible for the Trail of Tears, his family was not too far from here in Waxhaw, South Carolina, and he was born 6 years after this. Right. But then it gets even deeper. This is the tombstone of Catherine Calhoun. She was one of the people killed here, and this tombstone was erected by her son Patrick. Patrick was the father of John C. Calhoun. And for those of you who don't know who John C. Calhoun was, he went on to become Vice President of the United States under John Quincy Adams and Vice President of Andrew Jackson. This is his grandmother. And just to give you a little more info on him, he eventually came to own Fort Hill, South Carolina, and later gave that property to his son-in-law, Thomas Clemson. That became Clemson University. So the families that were here became the prominent families of the area. For those of you that have ever heard of Pickens, South Carolina, the county of Pickens was named after the famous Revolutionary War hero, Colonel Andrew Pickens. His mother was killed here. And not only that, but his wife was here as a child and escaped it. So this affected a lot of future generations. And I'm sure, as y'all can imagine, there were some negative feelings toward the Cherokee. Now, a lot of those families came to respect the Cherokee, and we know this because of actions later on from several people. But there was also a lot of hatred there. I mean, their family members were killed here. And not only that, this was part of the first Cherokee War. There were several. If any of you have ever seen the movie The Patriot with Mel Gibson, the Cherokee were mentioned several times by him in that movie. That's why he carried a Cherokee tomahawk. Right. That happened. That was this. All right. In the history books, it says that gold was discovered on Cherokee lands, and the greedy settlers just wanted their land. And that's why they forced them out. There's some truth to that. But that story's a lot more complicated than they just found gold. Right? There was a history of violence between the settlers and the Cherokee. And that's what this place represents. I don't know how much of that led to the Trail of Tears, but I know it had to play a part in it. I mean, it just had to. And for me, that helped answer my question of how could the people of that time do that? Well, this is how they could do that. I'm not trying to justify what they did in any way whatsoever, but I understand it now. And I think there's a lesson we can learn from this today. Right now with the country so polarized and, you know, right versus left and liberals and conservatives and so on, what we're talking about is our neighbors. And that's what this was. The Cherokee might not have wanted the people here, but they were here and that was their neighbors. Right? The people that forced marched them to Oklahoma. The Cherokee were their neighbors. They did that to their neighbors. Well, what we can learn from this is violence leads to violence. That's what this is. And today, you got to remember that the people that you disagree with politically, those are your neighbors. And violence leads to violence. Hey, folks, I hope you got something from this. And I hope it gives you a little bit of understanding of what happened then, but also a different way of looking at what's going on now and a different way to think about that. And as far as the Cherokee of that time, truthfully, I have no idea how they should have handled the settlers coming in. I mean, they were trying to protect their land. I understand that. I'm not faulting the Cherokee for what happened here, in the least. I have no idea how they should have handled it. But I can say they shouldn't have handled it with violence. That's the one thing I can say. This shouldn't have happened. And I'm sure many atrocities were committed against the Cherokee in the same time period. I have no doubt about that. But here we are now, standing in the middle of nowhere with an empty grave site. There are no Cherokee here. None. They handled it wrong. So just keep that in mind when you're thinking about how to handle issues you might be having. All right, folks, if you like this video, please hit the thumbs up. It helps out the channel. I'm going to get back on some other projects, the cabinet build that I was working on earlier for the channel. So if you want to see any of that later on, just hit the subscribe button. God bless, and y'all have a good day.